matter, they blame those who oppose the lockdowns and mandates for the failure of the lockdowns and mandates. What must be considered the most unethical abrogation of duty in modern history was done by America's universities and school leaders. Almost all of Western Europe recognized the spring 2020 data that all over the world there was a minuscule risk to healthy children for serious illness. So Western Europe opened schools for the 2021 year, even during otherwise stringent lockdowns, but most of America's governors closed in-person schools. And what happened, we all know, hundreds of thousands of child abuse cases went unreported because schools are the #1 agency to report that. Mental health disorders in teenagers and college-age children skyrocketed. Self-harm by teenagers doubled to tripled. Overdoses and substance use disorders in teenagers increased by 40 to 120%, and massive learning losses occurred. These were from the shutdowns, not from the virus. And these learning losses, as UNICEF's 2022 update pointed out, disproportionately affected students from disadvantaged backgrounds and concentrated among poor students. I thought we were a society that cared about the poor and that prioritized our children. Across the United States, almost all colleges and universities required vaccination, boosters, testing, and quarantining of healthy, asymptomatic students. Yet back in October 2020, before any vaccine, with the most harmful form of this virus, the CDC had on its website for schools, quote, "It is unethical and illegal to test someone who does not want to be tested." That CDC posting has been removed. You cannot find it. Why?
Yeah, the one that's not.
Meanwhile, many of our so-called elite university medical centers, Duke, Hopkins, Stanford, among others, sponsored by Pfizer, the vaccine maker, shamefully engage in an NIH clinical trial of vaccines injecting healthy infants and toddlers with this experimental drug for a disease they have no significant risk from. Is that now the standard for medical ethics in university research hospitals? And even if it were true that vaccines prevent the spread of infection, which it does not after only several weeks, according to the data from all over the world, what kind of society uses its children as human shields for adults? Hard to say this line without choking up, so I'm going to skip that line. Beyond the death and destruction, we have set up a public health disaster in our younger generation. During the lockdown, more than half of college-age students in the United States had an unwanted weight gain that averaged 28 pounds. That's an obesity epidemic. Mandela said there can be no keener revelation of society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. Americans are now faced with the new status quo because the response to being challenged on the data on our university campuses was intimidation, character assassination, and censure. We have a biased social media now joining the dominant voice on campus to be the arbiter of allowable discussion. When it counted most in 2020, when school closures and lockdowns were being implemented, my interviews as advisor to the president were pulled down by YouTube. My Twitter account was blocked while stating data. You might think the public wants to know what the advisor to the president was saying. Let's also understand clearly, when you censor science and health policy, it's not simply an abstract evil, a less than ideal environment for discussion and diversity of opinion. People die, and people died from the censorship of correct science policy. But it's not only the matter of academic freedom. Documents that talk about academic freedom are of no value. Stanford has its 50th anniversary of its document for academic freedom next year. This is not Babylon B, this is actual reality. From the censorship, the concept of science has been seriously damaged. Even the best academic journals in the world have become contaminated by politics and publish false declarations of consensus. That adds to the public's confusion. It has severely diminished trust in experts. As a health policy scholar for over 15 years, and as a professor at top universities for 30 years, as a graduate of this University of Chicago School of Medicine, when facts mattered, when critical thinking formed the basis of my education, I fear for our students. Many faculty members of our acclaimed universities are now dangerously intolerant of opinions contrary to their favored narrative. But defamatory attacks, character assassination are not acceptable in civilized society, let alone on our great universities. Worse than a violation of ethical behavior among colleagues, it does not meet my standard of simple human decency. The sad truth is that cancel culture on campus is highly effective. It prevents people from speaking out. But even more destructive, it teaches the worst possible behavior to our children, the next generation of leaders. If academic leaders fail to renounce that shameful conduct, many more experts with a reputation to lose will be unwilling to serve their country in contentious times. As educators, as parents, as citizens, that would be the worst possible legacy to leave to our children, the next generation of stewards of this country. All legitimate scientists today and ethical university leaders should be openly admitting their errors, but instead, they are not, and others call for forgiving and forgetting. No, that must not be allowed. Why not? Because we have an ethical society, and the public needs to know the truth. Because we need to succeed in the next pandemic, the next inevitable crisis to come. And because we need to restore trust, and that requires, as a simple starting point, demanding the admission of failure, a public apology by people who advocated lockdowns. Because they must never be able to impose those destructive policies again. Of course, we cannot expect their apology, because apology requires integrity. What can we as Americans do? I and others, including some in this room, are working on policies to restore trust and accountability in science. Many specific reforms need to be implemented: decentralizing science funding, adding accountability to universities receiving hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars per year, improving transparency on science agencies, adding term limits to stop career bureaucrats from accumulating power, and more. Let's be clear though, it's not enough to issue statements on academic freedom. We as individuals, we all, each one of us, has the burden of being critical thinkers to make the best decisions for ourselves and our families. The era of accepting what so-called experts say, simply based on their titles alone, is over. That means we must learn the facts, analyze them with critical thinking, and then form the opinion. That's the order, by the way, not the reverse. Second, we have a disastrous void in courage in our society today. Perhaps most alarmingly at universities, our training ground for America's next leaders. C.S. Lewis said, "Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point." If our democracy with its defining freedoms is to survive, we need good people, individuals with integrity, and there are many, to rise up. And that means speak up, as we are allowed, as we are expected to do in free societies, or we have no chance. Specifically, we need young people with courage, like the people organizing this meeting. Our rising leaders to reinstate the moral background, the ethical backbone, the ethical compass, the basic civility that is disappearing from this country. We cannot have a society filled with people, led by people who refuse to allow the discussion of views counter to their own. And finally, to the students, we must never forget what G.K. Chesterton said. Right is right, even if nobody does it. Wrong is wrong, even if everybody is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Atlas. That was fantastic. Now for our first panel entitled The Betrayal of Academic Ethics. We will be moderating it by Rachel Fulton Brown, an associate professor of history at the University of Chicago. She offers courses on the history of Christianity, medieval European religious, cultural, and intellectual history, and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. She has held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Humanities Center, among others. She founded the Corona Testing Control Group in September 2022, which I have been a part of, to pray for wisdom and protection against the dragons of modernity ravaging our college campuses with their vaccine mandates and suppression of speech. This group is largely responsible for putting today's symposium together. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Fulton Brown. By the way, folks, go ahead and please press the button on the mic in front of you until the light is off, just so we don't have any feedback. Thank you very much.
You left out the rest of the intro that I wrote for myself, which explains the dragons, which I will be happy to do. Academics like to believe that we are the ones who will see the bad things coming. We build models, study history, promise ourselves never again. But then the monster comes and we make the same old mistakes over and over again. Fighting the last war, demonizing anyone who dares to contest the consensus, and ramping up the propaganda to protect ourselves from the imagined mob. Some of us saw the monster back in spring 2020 and tried to name it clearly, but in the grip of a panic, that is not what most people want to hear. They want promises that we are fighting the monster, not mirrors in which to see themselves as the monster they would kill. I speak bluntly. The monsters are us. Perhaps it is my training as a medievalist that makes me all too used to having to contest the established narrative. Perhaps it is teaching for decades in our core sequence on the history of European civilization, with the structures of the French Revolution and Auschwitz echoing down the years. Perhaps it comes from my teaching my course on Tolkien every third year since 2005. But when the One Ring announced itself in spring 2020, I recognized it instantly. The ring is the voice that tells you, be afraid, be very afraid. Do you remember the fear in spring 2020? The doubt and confusion, the insistence that we must do something, anything to fight the monster that was pounding on the door? I remember particularly the flood of emails that came through my campus inbox offering money for studying COVID and the effects of COVID. Much like the Parisian doctors were called upon in 1348 to explain the plague. Was it earthquakes? This was the plague in 1348. The alignment of the planets, enemy action, biological warfare, sin. People fled the cities. The clergy stayed at that point and died. Was there a cure? Could medicine help? Such cultural memories are strong. Thus we get quarantines, aka lockdowns, not to mention plague masks. It worked in the Middle Ages. Shouldn't it work now? Did I mention the echoes? First they came for the socialists, the trade unionists, the Jews. Pastor Martin Niedermüller's warning has been repeated ad nauseum these past several years to little effect. I wrote early in May 2020 about the effect that COVID was having, not on health, but on our wills to do anything other than blame the virus for our inaction. One COVID to rule them all. One COVID to find them. One COVID to bring.
COVID deaths than 60% of states, including right here in Illinois, Governor Pritzker.
In May, COVID to rule them all. One COVID to find them. One